You're listening to Contesting Wrestling, episode 27. Minisode 27. Sorry, we're recording.
Get it right, Evan.
We're recording this on 420, and guys, this is the first time I've ever been high when we've recorded this podcast.
This is actually the first time Evan's ever been high in his life.
I was gonna joke that 420, of course, has no particular significance to us.
No.
But
I am sober. I have never touched a marijuana.
Not one.
Not
my
one
favorite
marijuana.
my favorite weed-related Onion article of the last several years is the Photoshop of I think it's Mitch McConnell with a joint hanging out of his mouth. Says depressed over the state of the country, he decides to end it all by smoking a joint.
Yes.
Jeff Sessions. It's Jeff, one of them political guys. Sessions, yeah.
Sessions has more direct, or did have more direct impact on
drug policy.
Look,
yes.
guys, I'm just high on my love and acceptance within the flat Earth community. We are reflecting on the what came out this week? Mick Foley won.
The Cactus Jack. Yeah.
Cool.
Episode 26.
The punk rock days of Mick Foley.
Is Mick short for anything? Is Mick short
Michael.
for something? Michael.
He said that in his book he famously talked about when he first met Vince McMahon, Vince would call him Mike, and instead, as he put it, instead of correcting him once, he allowed himself to be called the wrong name for an hour and a half, because he's never been Mike, he never wanted to be Mike.
Michael Francis Foley.
But he was always Mick, or when he was a kid he was Mickey, like Mickey Foley, you know? Yeah, Michael Francis Foley.
Francis was his middle name, which might explain, his hardcore stylings as compensation for that.
I also
Mickey Francis, yes.
It's good to drop Mickey as an adult. I know exactly one adult that still goes by Mickey, and honestly, it's a poor choice. I think it's a poor choice. I don't think he listens to this.
No, you should hear
so
it.
I'm going to take this risk.
You could do something about it.
Do we know anyone that goes by Mickey or has ever gone by Mickey, Doc?
We don't know anybody that goes by Mickey.
So did we get anything wrong? Did we get anything wrong this episode?
Nothing
Corrections,
wrong.
omissions?
One thing I wanted to talk about at this point, because we were talking about wrestler autobiographies, is the fact that in Ric Flair's autobiography that we mentioned, he famously insulted Mick Foley, calling him a glorified stuntman, which then ended up being kind of the basis for their feud that happened first in WWA and then in TNA. So I wouldn't be surprised. Years later. But I wouldn't be surprised if Flair put it in there just thinking, that could be good business eventually.
Do you think Ric Flair... I feel like there's one of two things that he does in his either he goes woo at all kinds of shit, right? It's just like all day long in the supermarket, his friends and family are tired of it. It shocks strangers who are around him. Or he never does it unless he's getting paid. Which do you think it is?
I bet you he does it for free a lot.
I bet you if you ran into him on the street and you were like, woo, he'd woo back.
I'm sure he would.
Hope
I'm
Maybe,
sure
depending on the mood
so.
he was in.
He's never been known as the most savvy businessman, it's kind of famous amongst the circles that would talk about this, that Rey Mysterio will charge you hundreds of dollars for an autograph because that's how he makes his money, But Ric Flair never saved a dime. Always, his reputation is he always bought drinks for everybody at the bar, the whole crew, because he was on top. And occasionally his credit card
And
would
he's,
just
Why he ended up
Because-
selling his Hall of Fame ring.
Yeah, which they then gave him another one. Katie, you were saying
He's also been robbed blind in every divorce he's ever been through.
he says Beth, the woman he was with the longest.
Isn't that Charlotte's mom?
Yeah, Charlotte's mom. His attitude towards her is, she was married to me while I was Ric Flair. She took half of my stuff and she's entitled to it. Then the several women who took advantage of him in rapid succession after that divorce. Yeah, his latest lady, who they had a commitment ceremony, but they're never going to actually get married. And I don't think she's going to mess with him too hard because she's not like a 22-year-old model looking for the old guy with money. She's actually an old head in the wrestling business. Managed him way back in like 1990 as Fifi the Maid. Although she's not Fifi the Maid anymore, that's for sure.
She's Fee-Frell Jenkins.
Fee-Frell Jenkins Flair, right?
Going back to where this whole Flair thing came from. So he called Foley a glorified stuntman. And I think in some ways, you know, that echoes at least your sort of initial judgment of him, Evan, when we, you know, in the first episode we did on Foley. Would you say that to any degree reflects your attitude?
I think that
as a wrestler, maybe not so much as a character.
As a wrestler, I do think part of my issue with Foley definitely is that for me, too much of his appeal is based around how far he's willing to go in hurting himself. Once again, I understand that in the context of the time, that was super revolutionary. I also understand just from an artistic perspective, like, you know, dedication to your art and all that, and, you know, what you're willing to sacrifice and that kind of thing. And it better to be a Mick Foley and hurt yourself for the edification of others than, I don't know, Gigi Allen. Take shits on other people.
Yeah. Or a Vader. So this ties into something else I wanted to talk about. How, like, you didn't really get Vader, Big Van Vader as a character. And I was thinking about it, and a lot of Vader's mystique and appeal when you were a kid is that he really seemed to be hurting people. And from all reports, he was. And
right. Like, there'd be reports of, like, enhancement guys would come looking for their job that day, and they'd see the paper, it would be them versus Vader, and they'd just leave. They'd just be like, I'm not doing this for $100.
But if you got him up against another guy who was really willing to be hurt and hurt someone else, it could be magic. Like Foley or like Stan Hansen, they had these classic brawls, and it's just these two enormous dudes really beating the shit out of each other.
Yeah, just wailing on each other in the face.
You know, to the point where they're not going to injure each other. Probably. I mean, they might. But, you know, pushing it to that level. There's something compelling about that.
No, and I have to admit that while I don't enjoy watching those super hardcore matches, there is definitely something that fascinates me about the difference between, because I can absolutely wrap my head around two guys going to like an actual underground like Fight Club cage match and for real like beating the shit out of each other and trying to murder each other. But the fact that it's two guys who probably would also be kind of into that, but then there's just there's just something else in there that's like, no, you know what? Let's do this, but somewhat fictitiously for the purposes of entertaining others. That's an extra layer of insanity that is appealing and very interesting.
They want to be known and revered and loved for it, right? Not just do it.
Yes.
Right. They don't just want to hurt people. I mean, they want to hurt people, but they don't just want to hurt people. That's the thing.
It's the fact that they are like, no, they don't have the intention to like murder each other like two guys in my underground fight club that I'm making up right now.
No, they like each other. Probably.
They like each other. That's the thing. It's not even like an MMA thing where they're like trying to necessarily prove one is better than the. It's not competitive like that. It's the fact that like these two guys are like, let's go and basically do to each other what we would do in a human cockfighting ring, but like pull back just enough where we don't actually murder each other, and then we're gonna do it like for money for other people's enjoyment. I don't know. Yeah, it's
well, in Beyond the Mat, they interview Mick Foley and Terry Funk, and you know Terry Funk talks about how like the more ridiculous stuff they do to each other, and they had a bunch of matches in Japan and like around the hardcore scenes. And they say the worse stuff you do to each other, the more the fans like it, and then the more fans come to see it. And then when the more fans come to see it, you get paid more for doing it. And the more you get paid for doing it together, the more you like each other. And that's where like the brotherhood of that comes from. It's more like this is an act together. Instead of I'm doing it to you, it's we're doing this.
On that note, like, it definitely, there is a divide in the wrestling audience. Like, there's a certain amount of overlap, but the crowd that's looking for more and more hardcore shit is quite distinct from the sort of like mainstream wrestling, like mainstream smart wrestling fans or like indie wrestling fans.
Yes,
it wasn't true. Like that so much in the late 90s, early 2000s. There was much more overlap because ECW had been the standard in indie wrestling. But, you know, it stopped being the 90s. And another thing I wanted to talk about was, you know, we've been talking about how Foley is kind of this like 90s edgy kind of character. It's been very hard for a lot of people, I think, of our generation, but especially not wrestling fans, to let go of 90s edgy as like the predominant aesthetic.
Yeah, and it's like it's such this short time frame too, and then like the scheme of things, like this 5 years that people
it was
won't
so
let
cool
die.
though. I mean, we had grunge, and like, you know, everybody was dressed in black, and like.
Well, I think Katie was specifically referring to wrestling during those years.
Yeah,
though, right?
yeah.
But yes. No, you're absolutely right, Katie.
No, grunge has simply become classic rock, you know, and that's fine.
And Stone Cold
Great.
Steve Austin is classic wrestling, right? And DX and all that
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
I think they just figured out. I think there was just a point where they figured out the overlap between people who want to see wrestling happen and people who want to hear like kind of like moody guitar-based rock music.
New metal. It was the
by
perfect
depressed
marriage,
people.
dude.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's. I think they hit on that, and they were like, let's just ride this for as long as we can. I feel like the mainstream culture did not, you know, really leave that behind until very recently. You know what I mean? Like that was like post grungy kind of new metal-y rock sort of stuff was still very popular out in most of the country. Especially, I think it started mixing kind of with country music at a certain point in like the late 2000s
that's definitely
or
what
early
happened.
11s or early teens.
It definitely got more in with the country music people.
Kid Rock pioneered his way to that, and that's about the most positive thing I can say about Kid Rock.
You know, speaking to kids, here's a phrase that isn't said very often. Speaking to Kid Rock purely as an artist. He was way ahead of his seriously.
He was.
The dude was way ahead of his time every step of his career, from being like nasty white rapper out of Detroit to new metal guy to rock or country guy to country guy. He was always ahead of the curve. He still is.
My
The
name is
the single
Douchebag.
biggest waste of WrestleMania time in history.
Yes.
WrestleMania 25, I think.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, God.
What an insult to all of those women. That whole thing was just an insult to all of those women. From the Kid Rock fucking thing at the beginning, from top to bottom. Then Santina won, remember?
Right, and then Santino
the
won.
whole thing
It was
an
such an
insult
to the women
to the
and to
women.
like most of the workers on the card. Like there were tons of matches on the show and none of them got any time. And then you had the fucking just atrocious main event between Triple H and Randy Orton. Anyway, yeah.
Oh man, right. And Kid Rock got like 22
Yeah, and
minutes
Rey
or
Mysterio
something.
and CM Punk got 9.
Yeah, my favorite part
Didn't
of that
the match
performance.
get bumped? Didn't something get bumped?
Something did Daniel Bryan
This
and
was Daniel Bryan.
Was that... No, that was
is
too early.
pre-Daniel
That
Bryan?
was too early.
Okay. I don't know.
This was Mania 25. I'm looking it up.
I know the greatest clip of that is Kid Rock stopping for a second like he would at his concert to let the crowd finish the line from one of his gigantic
booed.
hits, and nobody.
booed.
He gets booed. You can't hear anybody say any lines. It was just a bunch of wrestling fans like, I didn't come here for this.
If it weren't
buddy.
for the
Can we
Undertaker,
please get back to
For the
WrestleMania?
Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels, it would be the worst WrestleMania. including this
There
year's
you
with
go.
no crowd.
There was a dark match on the at the beginning of the show, with the Colognes versus Miz and Morrison.
Ah.
I don't know if it was bumped, but it didn't get on the main show, and they were the tag champs of their respective brands. So the tag champs didn't get on the show, but this Kid Rock abomination took up time.
So before we, I know this is a mini and we don't want to go too long, but I wanted to mention that we got a new patron this week. We got at Space King Bobby on Twitter.
Nice.
He's been a follower of our show. Yeah.
Awesome.
Hi, Bobby.
Hi, Bobby. I've been on one of his shows. He's cool. He's very motivated and internet savvy young dude, and you see him on Twitter all the time. He's one of the guys who's been repping us just about the entire time we've been a podcast. So we're happy to welcome him into Patreon. He's already
Give
started.
us your money.
He is. He's already started listening to our premium episodes. He just listened to our Hogan premium episode, and he has some Hogan requests. And we'll debate those and see what we can see. You can reference our Twitter account at ContestingW if you want to see more about that. But we'll get him in somewhere somehow. We'll start working on maybe incorporating some of those, or at least some of the matches like the ones you're talking about in mid-90s WCW. And it's just quite a wacky time. And thank you once again very much for signing on up. If you would like to sign up for a Patreon, $1 a month gets you all of the episodes as they are edited instead of whenever they're scheduled. And we thank you very much. And for $5 a month, you get a whole extra episode every week. Because we record a whole extra episode every week. And so if you like the show, check us out, patreon.com/contestingwrestling.
Listeners, also be aware that we are working on acquiring some secret technology, meaning I ordered some crap that I should have ordered a long time ago. Where soon it's going to be a lot easier for us to have guests. So if you're tired of just the four of us yelling at each other, you get ready for a whole slew of fifth people to get in there and also yell at us.
Give us money.
Yes, and then you give us money and you'll be able to hear the premium, because we're gonna fucking lock the awesome guests behind the paywall, right? You can't go.
It's really just more of us telling you to stay out of the ocean.
Yeah.
We can't implore that enough.
We can't say that enough.
Speaking of
stay out
money,
of the ocean, stay off of the beach.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the all the releases from WWE.
Oh,
WWE,
yeah.
The other
Oh
day.
yeah.
Ain't that a kick
Mike
in the head?
Chioda, 30 years, gold watch, computer took your job.
Hard times, Daddy.
That's what I got.
Michael Muhammad Knight posted on Facebook these three facts that happened like one day after the next, and they sort of put it into perspective. That first, Florida rescues WWE's billion-dollar Fox deal by declaring WWE a required resource for the survival of the species, because they were declared essential services in the state of Florida. Then,
so they're still recording at the Performance Center. They're going to be recording Raw and SmackDown in some form
and
live
NXT
every week.
I'll
and
probably
NXT.
still keep watching that. There's matches I want to see. I mean,
no, NXT is great.
I know, it's just like
Ben.
it's just sad, man. Like, I see the match and I'm like, whoa, this would be really cool if they did it in front of a crowd that was really into it.
Anyway, what was step 2 you were going to say?
All right. Number 2 is Trump naming Vince McMahon as one of his advisors for restarting the economy. And then the next day, they released like 40 people. They fired or furloughed, and they weren't really upfront about or transparent about that. Like wrestlers, agents, support staff.
I do
Mike
feel
Chioda,
like all the producers and
referee.
agents are probably the ones that are furloughed. They just don't need
Yeah, it seems
that level
like
of
that's the
agents
case.
right now, because they don't have the amount of people they usually do, and they don't have the amount of product that they usually do going on, so they just don't need to have that many agents around. I feel like those guys are going to be the ones that are hired back.
As far as like the wrestlers go, I mean, I'll be the first to tell you that they've had a bloated roster for years, but most of that is because they had been hiring almost everybody they could and just keeping them under contract without even using a bunch of them, just so other major wrestling companies couldn't use them. And it's really like it's really bad that as soon as like there's a problem, they're just cutting all these people off. They all just lost their jobs.
None of them can get jobs elsewhere either. Go on, Doc.
Right,
Sorry.
right. There aren't jobs to be had right now like that.
There just were.
Yeah, there just were.
When they wanted to wrestle, and you know,
here's the thing.
benched.
Say this virus didn't happen. If the WWE announced on a corporate level, like, look, we're bloated and we need to downsize a bit. We're sorry, but we're going to fire a bunch of people, and then they did. That would have been much better,
Yes.
actually. Because if there was this thriving wrestling scene all around the world, all of these people that were cut could find their way and integrate themselves into it rather easily. In fact, a lot of people...
And then years later,
Yeah,
when WWE needs new talent,
yeah, they can come
they
back.
can come back, and they'll be even more valuable.
A lot of people who had been mired in the WWE system for a long time say that when they get released into the indies, they make way more money that first year they're on the indies. Except now, none of these released guys can go anywhere or do anything because there isn't any wrestling happening anywhere. It's a terrible scene. It was really awful of them to do it, the way they did it. And, you know, it didn't even save them that much money in the corporate scheme of things. It
It
didn't even
saved
save
them the
them that much
paycheck
money.
they gave to Goldberg and one other thing.
Right, exactly. The biggest thing that they saved money on is that they've postponed moving their entire operation to a bigger building in Stamford, which they were going to do this year, which has nothing to do with anything we'd talk about on this podcast, really. It's purely like a corporate thing where they're like, we need bigger offices. Okay, so you get bigger offices. Now they don't need bigger offices anymore. That's my piece on that.
Yeah, I said most of my piece too.
That's about
It's
it.
fucked
That's
up.
the story.
I hope everybody can find work.
It's just the irony. It's just the irony of them being declared essential workers. Vince McMahon being given some sort of responsibility for getting the economy restarted, and then them immediately firing a bunch of people.
what a
just,
scumbag. What an
know.
absolute. And I just, you know what? I can't. I'll have a go.
Yeah.
We're gonna save
It's
it
okay.
for the Wrestlers Rise Up episode. Inform you our multi-part series on labor violations and how wrestlers should unionize. Hope.
Well, we are at some point soon going to watch a David Starr match, and maybe that can start the conversation.
I'm excited. I started following him.
Yeah.
I started
Sooner
following
than
him
you
on my own Twitter. So that's you know
yeah.
I'm that serious about him.
He's a firebrand.
This has been Contesting Wrestling Minisode. Check us out on Patreon. Follow us on Twitter at ContestingW. All that good stuff. My name is Evan Berg. We love you.
Bye. Stay out of the
Thank
ocean,
you.
everybody.